Tonight, we will wander together into the hushed and distant past, to a time when the gods of Greece walked unseen among mortals, and the air itself was thick with the weight of stories. Imagine you are far away from the present day, lying in a quiet place where only the soft sounds of nature fill the air. Perhaps it is night, and a silver moon hangs low over the horizon. Perhaps the wind carries the scent of the sea, faint and cool, as it brushes against your cheek. Here, in this place between waking and dreams, I invite you to join me on a long and gentle journey. The story of Medusa. Not the Medusa you might have heard of in brief and hurried retellings. Not the monster of children's books or the frightening face carved into shields. Tonight, we will take our time with her, learning not only about her fate, but about the world she lived in, the temples she walked through, the sea breezes she felt against her skin. We will explore the life she had before her name became a warning and before her face turned to stone in the minds of so many. The story will move slowly. We will not rush. We will linger on details. The color of light in the early morning, the sound of sandals against marble, the way the air might have smelled on the day she first stepped into a temple. There will be no sudden turns, no loud moments, nothing to disturb the quiet. You are safe here, listening, as the old world unfolds like a painted tapestry. Medusa's story has changed across centuries. In some tellings, she is a victim of divine cruelty. In others, she is a fearsome guardian, her image placed on buildings, shields, and coins to protect against harm. In still others, she becomes a symbol of feminine rage, of power, of transformation. Tonight, we will walk through all these versions carefully, as though turning the pages of an ancient scroll, each layer revealed with patience. And while you listen, you may find your mind drifting, perhaps picturing the sea around the Greek islands, or the sun spilling over whitewashed stone, or the shadows stretching long across an olive grove at dusk. That is as it should be. This story is here for you to rest with, to listen when you wish, and to let go of when sleep begins to pull you gently away. So breathe in, slowly, and let the air settle. The day is behind you now. The story waits, and it will carry you wherever you wish to go. Let us begin. Long before the name of Medusa was whispered in the dark, long before the myths of her gaze and her serpents, there was the land itself, Greece, as it was in the earliest days of its stories. Imagine the mainland rising out of the sea like a vast hand, each finger tipped with a rocky headland or a sheltered cove. Around it, thousands of islands lay scattered like jewels upon the water, their coasts wrapped in white sands and quiet harbors. The air was rich with the scent of pine forests, of wild thyme growing on the hillsides, of salt drifting in from the Aegean. In the valleys, olive trees stood in patient rows, their silver-green leaves catching the light like 1,000 small mirrors. The wind moved gently between them, carrying with it the faint hum of insects and the distant sound of water trickling over stones. Villages lay close to the land, built of pale stone, their roofs of clay tiles glowing warm under the sun. In the morning, the streets would fill with the shuffle of feet as farmers carried baskets of figs and pomegranates to the market. Fishermen returned from the sea, their nets heavy with glistening catch, the air thick with the scent of salt water and fresh fish. Women would gather at wells, their voices low and friendly, exchanging news as they drew water in smooth clay jars. Children played among the columns of half-built temples, chasing each other in the dusty courtyards. Here, stories were not a pastime, but a necessity. The people believed that the world they lived in was shaped, guided, and guarded by the gods. There was a god for the sea, a god for the sun, a goddess for the hunt, and countless lesser spirits who watched over groves, rivers, and household hearths. Before planting their crops, the farmers poured a small libation of wine to the earth. Before setting sail, the fishermen whispered a prayer to Poseidon. Even the act of lighting a lamp at dusk was done with a quiet nod to Hestia, keeper of the home fire. In the evenings, when the work of the day was done, families and neighbors would gather in the fading light. Perhaps they sat on low stools outside their homes, the air cooling around them as the first stars appeared. Perhaps they gathered in the larger open spaces, the agora, the public square, where merchants' stalls had been cleared away and the scent of fresh bread still lingered. There, the storytellers spoke. Some told of great battles and victories. Others spoke of love and betrayal, of journeys across the unknown seas. But often, the tales were of the gods and their deeds, of strange creatures and distant lands where no mortal had walked. It was in such settings that the first whispers of the Gorgons may have been spoken. Far to the west, it was said, beyond the edge of the known world, lived 3 sisters. 2 were immortal and fierce, beyond imagining, but the third was different. She was mortal. Her name was Medusa. In those earliest days, the Gorgons were not yet the figures we think of now. They were guardians, protectors, their image carved into the stones of temples to ward off evil. The stories of their origin shifted like the tides. Some said they were born of sea deities, others that they had been shaped by the gods as keepers of sacred places. What was consistent was their mystery. They lived far away, apart from mortals, their lives hidden from the eyes of those who told their tales. Medusa, the mortal sister, was the one whose story would grow the most. Over time, her life, her choices, and her fate would be told and retold in many ways, until she was no longer just a distant figure on a forgotten shore, but a presence that haunted the imagination of poets, painters, and sculptors for centuries. But for now, she is only a name drifting on the lips of storytellers under the Greek stars, part of a world where gods might pass through the marketplace unseen, and where the next dawn would bring another telling of another tale. And as we move forward, we will step gently into her world, into the time when she was not yet a legend, but simply a woman living in the bright and restless land of Greece. Trade routes of the Greek world, there were places so distant that they belonged as much to imagination as to geography. Sailors spoke of them in low voices over mugs of watered wine, their words carrying just enough uncertainty to make them believable. Among these far-off realms, one place was said to be the home of the Gorgon sisters, Steno, and the youngest, Medusa. The Gorgons were unlike any other beings in the Greek imagination. In some tellings, they were the daughters of ancient sea deities, Perseus and Ceto, beings born in the early shaping of the world, before the Olympian gods claimed their thrones. In others, they were born from the union of the earth and sea itself, their forms carrying both the power of the waves and the endurance of stone. Steno, the eldest, was said to be the fiercest. Her strength was legendary, her form unyielding. She had eyes that could pierce the horizon, and a voice that could shake the cliffs along the shore. She was immortal, her life unending, untouched by time. Sailors told of her red-gold hair that caught the light like fire at sunset, though they also whispered of her teeth, sharp as the edges of broken shells. Euryale, the middle sister, was quieter but no less formidable. She was known for her beauty, a beauty that could both entice and unsettle, and for her voice, which could sing so sweetly that the sea would still itself to listen. Yet, when angered, her cry was a sound so piercing that it could drive even the most steadfast warriors to their knees. Like Steno, she was immortal, her existence stretching endlessly through the ages. And then there was Medusa. Unlike her sisters, she was mortal. Her life would one day end, and she lived with the knowledge of that end, as all mortals do. In some stories, this mortality made her gentler, more connected to the world of humans. In others, it made her all the more dangerous, for she carried the urgency of someone whose days were numbered. The three sisters lived together, far from the lands of men, in a place said to be beyond the ocean's edge. The island they called home was not a barren wasteland, as some later tales would paint it, but a place of wild beauty. Jagged cliffs rose above the restless sea, their faces painted with moss and lichen in shades of green and gold. The air was filled with the cries of seabirds, and in the evenings the wind carried the deep, steady rhythm of waves breaking against the rocks below. The Gorgons were guardians. In some versions of the myth, they protected sacred relics or hidden temples. In others, they were keepers of ancient knowledge, their island a place where the secrets of the world were kept safe from mortal hands. Whatever their role, they were not aimless wanderers or monsters without purpose. They had a place in the order of things, a role shaped by forces older than the Olympian gods themselves. But as the stories traveled from one mouth to another, from one generation to the next, the details began to shift. In some tellings, their hair was made of living serpents, each one moving with its own will, their scales glistening like polished bronze in the sunlight. In others, the serpents were only a symbol, a way to capture the untamed power that seemed to ripple through them. Their eyes, it was said, could turn the onlooker to stone, a gift or curse that no mortal could survive. Medusa's mortality set her apart from her sisters in another way as well. While Steno and Euryale remained unchanged across the centuries, Medusa could grow, could change. She could be shaped by the passage of time, by joy and sorrow, by choices and mistakes. The poets who spoke of her often lingered on this difference, as if her humanness was the key to her story, and perhaps, in the end, it was. Despite their fearsome reputation, the Gorgons were not constantly at war with the world. They did not seek out mortals to harm. Instead, they lived apart, their island a place mortals only reached by accident or by great and dangerous effort. Most who heard of them would never come close to their shores. The idea of the Gorgons was enough, a reminder that there were powers in the world that could not be tamed, that some places were not meant to be touched. And yet, for all the whispers of their danger, there was something protective about their presence. Their likeness was carved into shields, painted onto pottery, etched above doorways. The image of a Gorgon's face, wide-eyed, fierce, unyielding, was believed to ward off evil. In this way, the Gorgons lived in the heart of Greece without ever setting foot upon its soil. They were both feared and revered, both distant and intimately close. In this delicate balance of awe and fear, Medusa's life unfolded. She was part of something ancient, bound to her sisters by blood and by destiny, and yet she was different. She was mortal, and mortals have stories that move forward, that change, that end. As we move through her tale, we will see how this difference would shape not only her fate, but the way she would be remembered for thousands of years to come. For now, we leave the three sisters on their island, the wind curling around their cliffs, the sea forever at their feet, a place on the edge of the world, where the boundary between myth and reality is as thin as the mist rising from the waves. Before she became the figure known to every storyteller in Greece, Medusa was simply a young woman, a mortal among immortals, living in a world where the divine and human touched like the meeting of sea and shore. In these earliest days of her life, before any curse or fateful encounter, she walked in the light of the sun as any other might, with the sound of waves in her ears and the warmth of the earth beneath her feet. In the tellings that speak of her youth, Medusa's beauty is described with care, though not in the hurried way of those who measure worth in fleeting appearances. Her hair, long and shining, caught the sun like strands of gold. Her eyes were bright and searching, reflecting the color of the sea on a clear day. Her skin, warm and sun-touched, carried the glow of someone who lived close to the open air, under skies that stretched far and unbroken. But beauty alone was not what defined her. Medusa was known for her devotion, to her duties, to her faith, to the quiet rituals that bound her life to the goddess she served. In many versions of the myth, she was a priestess in the temple of Athena, goddess of wisdom and war. The temple was a place of cool shadows and high echoing ceilings, the walls lined with carved reliefs of battles fought and victories won. The air smelled of oil lamps and crushed herbs, offerings left upon the altar. Her role in the temple was one of honor and discipline. Each day began at dawn, when the first pale light filtered through the columns and lit the polished marble floors. Medusa would sweep the temple's great hall, her footsteps soft on the stone. She prepared the offerings, bowls of olives, honey, and bread, placing them carefully before the statue of Athena. She tended the sacred fire, ensuring it never went out, for its light was a symbol of the goddess's eternal presence. As a priestess, she had taken a vow of chastity, dedicating herself wholly to service. This vow was not merely a rule, but a way of life. It meant that her thoughts, her time, and her devotion belonged to Athena alone. In return, she lived under the goddess's protection, moving through the world with a sense of purpose and belonging. Outside the temple walls, life in her city moved with a rhythm that had been the same for generations. Merchants called out in the marketplace, their stalls shaded by colorful awnings. Children ran between the columns of public buildings, their laughter carrying across the square. Farmers brought their produce in from the countryside, baskets of grapes, figs, and pomegranates, their hands stained with the colors of the harvest. In the evenings, families gathered in the glow of oil lamps, sharing bread and wine as the day's work gave way to rest. Medusa's place in this world was secure, though it was not without its challenges. To be mortal in a world where immortals walked unseen could be a burden. The gods, in their vastness, could be both protectors and destroyers. They could raise a mortal to glory or cast them down into shadow, often without warning. And yet, like all who lived in those days, Medusa accepted this truth. The gods were as much a part of life as the sun rising over the hills or the sea breaking against the shore. She was not untouched by human feeling. Those who tell her story speak of her kindness, how she offered food to the poor, how she tended to the sick, how she paused to speak with those who came to the temple in need of comfort. But they also speak of her strength. She carried herself with the calm assurance of one who knew her place in the world, and who met each day with quiet determination. In the evenings, when her duties were done, Medusa would sometimes walk along the shore. The beach was a place of solitude, the air cool with the breath of the sea. She would watch the gulls wheel overhead, their calls sharp and clear against the hush of the waves. She would listen to the distant creak of ships at anchor, the wind rattling their rigging, and as the sun sank into the horizon, she would feel the weight of the day slip away, leaving only the slow, steady pulse of the tide. It was in these moments, unguarded and alone, that she may have felt most herself. Away from the gaze of the city, away from the endless rituals and expectations, she was simply Medusa, a mortal woman in a vast and ancient world, breathing in the salt air and feeling the sand cool beneath her feet as night approached. In time, her beauty and her presence became known beyond the temple. Travelers who came to the city would speak of her in the next port, describing the golden-haired priestess who moved through the temple with grace and purpose. Some told of the way her eyes seemed to hold the light, or the way her voice carried like music through the temple halls. These tales, like all stories, grew in the telling. By the time they reached distant shores, Medusa was no longer just a young woman in service to a goddess. She was a figure of wonder, perhaps even touched by the divine herself. But for Medusa, life continued as it always had. The days turned to weeks, the weeks to months, the seasons shifting in their endless cycle. The olive trees flowered, their blossoms scattering in the wind. The summer sun baked the marble streets until they glowed white in the heat. The autumn rains returned, darkening the earth and filling the air with the scent of wet leaves. Winter brought cool, clear nights, the stars burning bright above the city. Through it all, she remained devoted to her place in the temple, unaware of how quickly everything could change. She could not have known that the stability of her life, the marble floors, the golden altars, the soft glow of the sacred flame, would soon give way to something entirely different. For now, she was a mortal woman with mortal dreams, moving quietly through the days, her life as steady and certain as the tide. The shadow of her future had not yet fallen across her path, and the name Medusa had not yet carried the weight of legend. The temple of Athena stood on a rise above the city, its marble columns catching the sunlight so that, from a distance, it seemed almost to glow. The climb up from the marketplace was steep, a winding path of smooth stone that had been worn by countless footsteps over generations. Along the way, the air grew quieter, the voices of merchants and townsfolk fading behind, replaced by the soft whisper of the wind against the hillside. When Medusa reached the top each morning, she would pause for a moment before entering. From here, she could see the whole sweep of the city below, the clustered rooftops of clay tiles, the glint of the harbour where ships rested at anchor, the green stretch of olive groves beyond the walls. The horizon lay open before her, the Aegean Sea rolling out toward distant islands that seemed to float in the blue haze. It was a view she never tired of, though she rarely lingered. The temple was not a place for idle wandering. Stepping inside, the air changed. The scent of the city gave way to the cool fragrance of incense and the faint tang of burning oil. Shafts of light filtered through narrow openings high in the walls, illuminating motes of dust that drifted lazily in the air. The floor was polished marble, its pale surface reflecting the faint shimmer of the sacred flame at the heart of the temple. The statue of Athena dominated the main hall, carved from ivory and gold, her gaze steady and unyielding. She stood with her shield raised, a spear in her hand, the figure of a small winged goddess, Nike, the spirit of victory, perched on her palm. At her feet lay the coiled form of a serpent, a reminder of her role as protector and guardian. As a priestess of Athena, Medusa had taken the sacred vow of chastity. This vow was more than a personal promise. It was a binding tie between the mortal and the divine. To break it was to dishonor not only the goddess, but the very order of the temple. The vow was spoken aloud during the initiation ceremony, in the presence of the high priestess and the assembled sisters of the temple. The words were simple, but the weight they carried was immense. to keep the body and spirit free of earthly bonds, to devote all thought and action to the service of Athena. The life of a priestess was structured around ritual and duty. At dawn, the temple came alive with the sound of soft footsteps and the faint rustle of linen robes. The first task was to tend the sacred flame, which burned in a bronze brazier at the center of the hall. Medusa would stir the embers gently, adding small pieces of olive wood until the flames rose again, steady and bright. Offerings followed: bowls of fruit, loaves of fresh bread, jars of honey and oil, arranged carefully before the statue. Each offering was placed with both hands, accompanied by a quiet prayer. The prayers were not hurried. Each word was given its place, each moment allowed to unfold like the opening of a flower. After the offerings came the cleansing of the temple. The marble floors were swept of dust, the altar cloths straightened, the bronze vessels polished until they gleamed. Water was drawn from the sacred spring nearby, cool and clear, and used to wash the hands and feet before certain rites. Every action had meaning, every movement was part of a greater whole. The afternoons were quieter. Sometimes the priestesses studied in the shaded courtyard, reading from scrolls or reciting hymns to the goddess. Other times they would weave, not simple cloth for garments, but intricate tapestries depicting the deeds of Athena, her birth from the head of Zeus, her gift of the olive tree to the city of Athens, her role in guiding heroes through their trials. These tapestries were hung along the temple walls, their colors vivid even in the dim light. At sunset, the evening rites began. The sacred flame was fed once more, and incense was lit so that its smoke curled upward in thin, twisting strands. Hymns were sung in low, steady voices, the words echoing softly beneath the high ceilings. When the final song ended, the temple would fall into stillness, the only sound the faint crackle of the flame. Medusa moved through this life with a quiet certainty. The vow she had taken was not a burden to her. She understood its purpose: to keep her focus clear, to ensure that her service to Athena was unbroken. The temple was a place apart from the chaos of the world, a place of order and peace. But the gods of Greece were not bound by the walls of any temple, and their will did not always align with the vows of mortals. The stories of that time are filled with moments when the divine touched the human, sometimes in kindness, sometimes in cruelty, often in ways that could not be predicted. And though Medusa could not know it, her vow, so carefully kept, would one day stand at the center of her fate. For now, her life remained as it always had been, rising with the sun, tending the flame, walking the long path down into the city to gather offerings, returning in the quiet of the evening to the temple's embrace. The days passed like beads on a string, each one similar to the last, each one carrying her forward without warning, toward the moment when all would change. The temple stood serene against the sky, its columns white in the moonlight. The sacred flame burned steadily, and Medusa's voice joined the other priestesses in their night hymn, unaware that the calm would not last forever. Somewhere beyond the sea, forces were already moving toward her, unseen but inevitable. There are moments in history and in myth when the course of a life shifts in a single breath. For Medusa, that moment began not with thunder or alarm, but with the stillness of the temple on an ordinary day. The marble floor was cool underfoot, the sacred flame burned in its steady rhythm, and the sea breeze drifted in through the open colonnade, carrying the scent of salt and distant rain. Outside, the city moved in its usual way. The market hummed with bargaining voices, the harbour clattered with the sound of ropes and sails, and the hills beyond were hazy in the warmth of the sun. But inside the temple, the air was different, heavier, as though it held the weight of something waiting to happen. In the old stories, the event is told in many ways. Some speak of a storm sweeping in from the sea, dark clouds gathering above the city as the god Poseidon approached. Others say there was no storm at all, only the quiet ripple of water along the shore as he stepped onto the land. Poseidon, god of the seas, was as unpredictable as the waves he ruled, sometimes generous, sometimes fierce, always moved by his own desires. The stories agree on one thing: he came to the temple of Athena, whether drawn by curiosity, by rivalry with the goddess, or by the sight of Medusa herself. The reason is left to the tellers to decide. What happened next is told in tones that shift with the centuries, sometimes harsh, sometimes softened, always marked as the moment that would seal Medusa's fate. Some versions speak plainly, telling of an act of violence that shattered the sacred vows of the temple. Others tell it in symbols: the sea breaking into a still harbor, the waves flooding a place meant to remain untouched. In this gentler telling, we do not dwell on the act itself, but on what came after. The silence that followed the cold stillness of the marble beneath. Medusa's knees, the awareness that something had been taken from her, something that could not be returned. The temple's walls, which had once been her refuge, now seemed to press in on her. The flicker of the sacred flame felt different, not a comfort, but a witness. Outside, the life of the city carried on, unaware that within these walls, the balance of a life had shifted forever. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, returned to her temple and saw what had been done. In some tellings, her anger burned like the noonday sun, directed not at Poseidon, but at Medusa. Perhaps it was because the temple had been defiled, its sanctity broken. Perhaps it was the rivalry between Athena and Poseidon that made the offense so sharp. Or perhaps, as some have suggested, the gods did not see mortals as we do, their punishments falling not always where they were deserved, but where they would be remembered. In that moment, Athena's gaze fixed on Medusa, once the golden-haired priestess, now the keeper of a broken vow. She stood in the goddess's presence, unable to change what had been done. The transformation that followed has been described in countless ways, but it always begins with that look, a gaze that saw through her, down to the marrow of her being. Her hair, once smooth and shining, began to shift. Locks turned to coils, coils to living serpents, their scales glistening in the dim light, their eyes sharp and unblinking. Her skin grew pale, her features sharper, her beauty twisted into something the mortal mind could barely hold. And her eyes, they became mirrors that no mortal could survive looking into, eyes that turned flesh to stone in a heartbeat. The temple that had been her home was no longer hers. The priestesses who had stood beside her now drew back in fear. The city beyond the hill no longer welcomed her. Athena's punishment was not death, but exile, a life apart, a life where her very presence was a danger to those she once loved. And so Medusa left. She walked down the long path from the temple to the harbor, though she did not look back. The streets she had known since girlhood now seemed narrow. The faces that had once greeted her turned away. She passed the market without hearing the voices, crossed the shore without feeling the sand beneath her feet, and stepped onto a small boat that would carry her away from everything she had been. The sea stretched out before her, calm and endless. The oars dipped in and out of the water, the rhythm steady, the horizon unmoving. Behind her lay the city, the temple, the life she had built. Ahead lay an island she had never seen, a place beyond the edge of maps. where no one would come willingly. As the sun sank toward the water, Medusa sat in the boat, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The serpents in her hair shifted and coiled, their tongues flicking at the salt air. The waves lapped gently against the hull, as if the sea itself was carrying her into this new life. The life of a priestess was structured around ritual and duty. At dawn, the temple came alive with the sound of soft footsteps and the faint rustle of linen robes. The first task was to tend the sacred flame, which burned in a bronze brazier at the center of the hall. Medusa would stir the embers gently, adding small pieces of olive wood until the flames rose again, steady and bright. Offerings followed, bowls of fruit, loaves of fresh bread, jars of honey and oil, arranged carefully before the statue. Each offering was placed with both hands, accompanied by a quiet prayer. The prayers were not hurried. Each word was given its place, each moment allowed to unfold like the opening of a flower. After the offerings came the cleansing of the temple. The marble floors were swept of dust, the altar cloths straightened, the bronze vessels polished until they gleamed. Water was drawn from the sacred spring nearby, cool and clear, and used to wash the hands and feet before certain rites. Every action had meaning, every movement was part of a greater whole. The afternoons were quieter. Sometimes the priestesses studied in the shaded courtyard, reading from scrolls or reciting hymns to the goddess. Other times they would weave, not simple cloth for garments, but intricate tapestries depicting the deeds of Athena, her birth from the head of Zeus, her gift of the olive tree to the city of Athens, her role in guiding heroes through their trials. These tapestries were hung along the temple walls, their colors vivid even in the dim light. At sunset, the evening rites began. The sacred flame was fed once more, and incense was lit so that its smoke curled upward in thin, twisting strands. Hymns were sung in low, steady voices, the words echoing softly beneath the high ceilings. When the final song ended, the temple would fall into stillness, the only sound the faint crackle of the flame. Medusa moved through this life with a quiet certainty. The vow she had taken was not a burden to her. She understood its purpose, to keep her focus clear, to ensure that her service to Athena was unbroken. The temple was a place apart from the chaos of the world, a place of order and peace. But the gods of Greece were not bound by the walls of any temple, and their will did not always align with the vows of mortals. The stories of that time are filled with moments when the divine touched the human, sometimes in kindness, sometimes in cruelty, often in ways that could not be predicted. And though Medusa could not know it, her vow, so carefully kept, would one day stand at the center of her fate. For now, her life remained as it always had been, rising with the sun, tending the flame, walking the long path down into the city to gather offerings, returning in the quiet of the evening to the temple's embrace. The days passed like beads on a string, each one similar to the last, each one carrying her forward without warning, toward the moment when all would change. The temple stood serene against the sky, its columns white in the moonlight. The sacred flame burned steadily, and Medusa's voice joined the other priestesses in their night hymn, unaware that the calm would not last forever. Somewhere beyond the sea, forces were already moving toward her, unseen but inevitable. There are moments in history and in myth when the course of a life shifts in a single breath. For Medusa, that moment began not with thunder or alarm, but with the stillness of the temple on an ordinary day. The marble floor was cool underfoot, the sacred flame burned in its steady rhythm, and the sea breeze drifted in through the open colonnade. carrying the scent of salt and distant rain. Outside, the city moved in its usual way. The market hummed with bargaining voices, the harbor clattered with the sound of ropes and sails, and the hills beyond were hazy in the warmth of the sun. But inside the temple, the air was different, heavier, as though it held the weight of something waiting to happen. In the old stories, the event is told in many ways. Some speak of a storm sweeping in from the sea, dark clouds gathering above the city as the god Poseidon approached. Others say there was no storm at all, only the quiet ripple of water along the shore as he stepped onto the land. Poseidon, god of the seas, was as unpredictable as the waves he ruled, sometimes generous, sometimes fierce, always moved by his own desires. The stories agree on one thing: he came to the temple of Athena, whether drawn by curiosity, by rivalry with the goddess, or by the sight of Medusa herself. The reason is left to the tellers to decide. What happened next is told in tones that shift with the centuries, sometimes harsh, sometimes softened, always marked as the moment that would seal Medusa's fate. Some versions speak plainly, telling of an act of violence that shattered the sacred vows of the temple. Others tell it in symbols: the sea breaking into a still harbor, the waves flooding a place meant to remain untouched. In this gentler telling, we do not dwell on the act itself, but on what came after. The silence that followed the cold stillness of the marble beneath. Medusa's knees, the awareness that something had been taken from her, something that could not be returned. The temple's walls, which had once been her refuge, now seemed to press in on her. The flicker of the sacred flame felt different, not a comfort, but a witness. Outside, the life of the city carried on, unaware that within these walls, the balance of a life had shifted forever. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, returned to her temple and saw what had been done. In some tellings, her anger burned like the noonday sun, directed not at Poseidon, but at Medusa. Perhaps it was because the temple had been defiled, its sanctity broken. Perhaps it was the rivalry between Athena and Poseidon that made the offense so sharp. Or perhaps, as some have suggested, the gods did not see mortals as we do, their punishments falling not always where they were deserved, but where they would be remembered. In that moment, Athena's gaze fixed on Medusa, once the golden-haired priestess, now the keeper of a broken vow. She stood in the goddess's presence, unable to change what had been done. The transformation that followed has been described in countless ways, but it always begins with that look, a gaze that saw through her, down to the marrow of her being. Her hair, once smooth and shining, began to shift. Locks turned to coils, coils to living serpents, their scales glistening in the dim light, their eyes sharp and unblinking. Her skin grew pale, her features sharper, her beauty twisted into something the mortal mind could barely hold. And her eyes, they became mirrors that no mortal could survive looking into, eyes that turned flesh to stone in a heartbeat. The temple that had been her home was no longer hers. The priestesses who had stood beside her now drew back in fear. The city beyond the hill no longer welcomed her. Athena's punishment was not death, but exile, a life apart, a life where her very presence was a danger to those she once loved. And so Medusa left. She walked down the long path from the temple to the harbor, though she did not look back. The streets she had known since girlhood now seemed narrow. The faces that had once greeted her turned away. She passed the market without hearing the voices, crossed the shore without feeling the sand beneath her feet, and stepped onto a small boat that would carry her away from everything she had been. The sea stretched out before her, calm and endless. The oars dipped in and out of the water, the rhythm steady, the horizon unmoving. Behind her lay the city, the temple, the life she had built. Ahead lay an island she had never seen, a place beyond the edge of maps, where no one would come willingly. As the sun sank toward the water, Medusa sat in the boat, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The serpents in her hair shifted and coiled, their tongues flicking at the salt air. The waves lapped gently against the hull, as if the sea itself was carrying her into this new life. The journey to Medusa's place of exile took her far from the shores she had known. Day by day, the boat carried her deeper into waters where few dared to travel. The coastline of Greece faded into memory, replaced by the endless swell of the sea, its colors shifting with the light, pale blue in the morning, deep green beneath clouds, and molten gold at sunset. The oarsman spoke little, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Perhaps he feared what would happen if he met her gaze. Perhaps the silence was simply part of the journey, a ritual observed when carrying one who bore the mark of the god's punishment. The only sounds were the slow, steady dip of the oars and the occasional hiss from the serpents in her hair as they tasted the salt wind. After many days, an island appeared, rising from the sea like the back of a great stone beast. Its cliffs were high and jagged, their faces streaked with shades of rust and grey where rain had run down over centuries. Waves crashed against the rocks below, sending up white plumes of spray that caught the sunlight like scattered pearls. Above the cliffs lay stretches of grassland and sparse forests of wind-bent trees, their branches twisted by years of salt and storm. This was where she would live, alone. The boat slipped into a small cove where the water lay calm. The beach here was made not of sand, but of smooth, rounded stones, each one polished by the sea. They clicked softly against each other with the movement of the tide, a sound that would come to be as constant to her as her own breathing. When she stepped onto the shore, no farewell was given. The oarsman pushed the boat back into the water and rowed away, his figure growing smaller with each pull. Medusa stood and watched until the vessel was only a dark shape on the glittering horizon. Then even that was gone, and she was alone. Her first days on the island were spent exploring. She found that it was not barren. There were fresh springs that trickled down from the cliffs, their water cool and sweet. Wild herbs grew among the rocks, thyme, rosemary, and sage, their scents released with the brush of her hand. Seabirds nested in the cliffs, their cries echoing in the still air, and fish swam in the shallows, flashing silver in the sun. She chose a cave as her home, set into the side of a cliff, where the wind could not easily reach. Inside, the walls were smooth and dry, the ceiling high enough for her to stand without stooping. The floor was strewn with driftwood and the shells of long-forgotten creatures. At the back of the cave, a narrow tunnel led to a small opening that looked out over the sea, a hidden window to the horizon. Here, her days began to take on a new rhythm. She rose with the sun, the serpents in her hair shifting restlessly at the first touch of light. She drank from the spring and gathered what food she could. Fish caught in shallow pools, eggs stolen from the nests of seabirds, herbs plucked from the rocky soil. She built a small fire near the mouth of the cave, feeding it with driftwood dried in the sun, its smoke curling into the sky. At times, the island felt peaceful. The air was clean, the sea was constant, and the nights were filled with stars brighter than she had ever seen from the city. There was a kind of freedom in the solitude. No duties, no vows, no watchful eyes of the goddess. But the cost of that freedom was heavy. For all its beauty, the island was a prison without walls. She could not leave without risking the gaze of others, and she knew that if a ship ever came too close, she must stay hidden. Even the simplest human contact was denied to her. The sound of another voice became a memory that faded with time. The serpents were her only companions. At first, she regarded them as part of the curse, a constant reminder of what had been done to her. But as the days passed, she began to sense that they were more than mere symbols of her exile. They reacted to her moods, hissing softly when she was uneasy, growing still when she was calm. Sometimes she thought they listened, tilting their heads slightly when she spoke aloud to herself. Seasons shifted. The winds of winter swept hard across the island, bringing rain that pounded the cliffs and filled the springs to overflowing. In summer, the sun beat down on the rocks until they shimmered with heat, and the air grew heavy with the scent of warm thyme and salt. She learned the paths of the seabirds, the way the tide marked the hours, the subtle changes in the sky that foretold a storm. In these long stretches of time, she had much to think about. She thought of the temple and the life she had left behind, of the faces of the other priestesses, now blurred by memory. She thought of Athena, and whether the goddess ever thought of her. She thought of the oarsman who had brought her here, wondering if he had told others of the woman with serpent hair living alone at the edge of the world. But more than anything, she thought of the way her story might be told. She knew that, in time, the tale of Medusa would reach other shores. It would be passed from mouth to mouth, embroidered with details to make it more wondrous, more frightening, more distant from the truth. She wondered if anyone would remember the woman she had been, or if they would only know the Gorgon whose gaze could turn stone cold. And so her life settled into the long, quiet years of exile, a life marked by the rhythms of wind and tide, the slow passage of days measured in light and shadow. She did not know that, far away, her name was already beginning to grow in the minds of sailors and storytellers. She did not know that her solitude would one day be broken by one who came not for company, but for her head. For now, she was simply Medusa, the lone inhabitant of an island where the sea met the sky. Her life as still and unchanging as the stone cliffs that surrounded her. The island where Medusa lived in exile was known in some tellings as Sarpedon, though the name was spoken rarely and only in whispers. Few had seen it, and fewer still had set foot upon its rocky shores. For most, it existed only in rumor, a place marked on old sailors' charts, with no more than a faint outline and the cautionary words, "Here be monsters." Yet Sarpedon was not without beauty. From the sea, its cliffs rose sharply, their faces weathered by centuries of wind and spray. In the morning light, the stone took on the pale hues of ivory and cream, while in the evening it glowed with deep shades of amber and rose. Below the cliffs, the sea was a shifting mirror of blues and greens, its surface flecked with white where waves met the rocks. The island's crown was a rolling expanse of grasslands, where the wind moved freely, bending the blades in long, slow waves. In spring, wildflowers dotted the slopes, small bursts of yellow, purple, and white that swayed gently under the sun. Here, bees hummed lazily from bloom to bloom, and butterflies, their wings like fragments of painted cloth, drifted on the air. Beyond the grasslands lay pockets of forest, where twisted pines clung to the hillsides and the scent of resin filled the air. In the quietest hours, when the sea breeze softened and the gulls had gone silent, these woods held a stillness so deep it seemed the world beyond the island had ceased to exist. The only sounds were the faint creak of branches and the distant murmur of the tide. The heart of Sarpedon was a small valley, sheltered from the harshest winds. Here, a spring bubbled up from the earth, feeding a clear pool fringed with reeds. The water was cool and sweet, and it became Medusa's source for drinking and washing. She kept the area clean, removing fallen branches and stones, so that the pool reflected the sky like a polished mirror. At night, when the moon was full, its silver light turned the surface to liquid glass. From the mouth of her cave, Medusa could see much of the island. The cliff on which her home was perched gave her a view of the cove below and the open sea beyond. She could watch the sun rise over the water, casting a path of gold toward her, and she could watch it sink each evening, the horizon aflame before the light faded into indigo and shadow. The cave itself she had made her own. She had gathered smooth stones from the beach to line a small fire pit, where she cooked her meals and kept warm on cooler nights. She arranged driftwood and sea-polished bones into low shelves for storing the few things she possessed. Clay jars for water-woven nets for fishing and the small trinkets the sea offered her. Shells with intricate spirals, fragments of pottery, and pieces of glass worn soft by the tide. It was here, in this solitary place, that she began to notice the island's rhythms. The wind had its patterns, soft and warm in the morning, stronger and salt-sharp by midday, cooling again as the sun sank. The sea, too, had its moods, shifting from glassy stillness to restless churning, sometimes in the space of a single day. The cries of the seabirds marked the hours, and at night, the sky unfolded its map of stars, unbroken by the smoke or firelight of human settlements. The solitude was deep, but it was not without its visitors. From time to time, ships would pass in the distance, their sails white against the horizon. Most gave the island a wide berth, for the sailors had heard the stories, that a woman lived there who could turn men to stone with a single glance. Those who sailed too near often claimed to hear strange sounds on the wind, the hiss of serpents, the whisper of a woman's voice, the faint clatter of stone against stone. On rare occasions, a desperate shipwreck would bring strangers to her shores. Some she allowed to leave, guiding them silently to the cove and watching until they were gone. Others, who came armed and curious, met the fate the stories promised, their bodies stilled, their forms frozen in the exact moment they had looked upon her face. These statues she left where they fell, scattered among the rocks and grass, their shapes slowly claimed by moss and lichen. Over time, they became part of the island's landscape, a warning to any who might think to seek her out. But Medusa's life was not one of constant violence. More often, her days passed in the quiet work of survival, tending her fire, mending her nets, gathering food, and keeping watch over the changing skies. She found comfort in small things, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the steady sound of the tide, the way the serpents in her hair would grow still when she sat by the spring in the late afternoon. The island shaped her, just as exile had. In the absence of human voices, she learned the language of the sea and wind. In the absence of mirrors, she came to know herself not by her reflection, but by the weight of her own thoughts. She was no longer the girl of the temple, nor entirely the monster of legend. She had become something else, something the world beyond Sarpedon would not understand. Yet even here, far from the cities and temples, she could not escape the pull of fate. Across the waters, her name was growing. Sailors told her story in crowded taverns, their voices low but eager. Poets wove her into their verses. Painters tried to capture her face on clay and canvas. Each telling made her more distant, more dangerous, more unlike the woman who lived quietly on the island's cliffs. And so, the days and nights passed on. The sea remained constant and unending as seasons turned and years folded into each other. Medusa lived between the tides, in a place where the world was both infinite and very small. The island was her prison and her refuge, her punishment and her home. Far from the island's rocky shores, in the harbours and marketplaces of the Greek world, Medusa's name began to move like a tide, slowly at first, then with a pull that could not be stopped. The sailors who skirted the edges of Sarpedon told stories when they returned to port, their voices carrying over the clatter of amphorae and the scent of fish drying in the sun. Each telling added something. A sailor might describe the shape of the island, the way its cliffs caught the evening light, and another would interrupt to speak of strange sounds heard across the water, a low hiss, or the faint rustle of something moving where no wind blew. Someone else would swear they saw a figure standing high on the cliffs, her hair alive with movement, watching their ship as it passed. These whispers moved inland, carried along the trade routes that wound through villages and cities. In the taverns of Athens, Corinth, and Thebes, travellers spoke of the woman with the gaze that could turn a man to stone. Some claimed she was a monster born from the sea, sent by Poseidon himself. Others said she had once been a mortal priestess, punished by Athena for a betrayal too great to speak aloud. The details shifted with the storyteller. In some versions, Medusa's serpents were as thick as a man's arm, their scales glinting like polished bronze. In others, they were small and quick, whispering secrets into her ears. Her eyes might be described as burning gold, or deep green, or black as obsidian. Whatever image would make the listener's skin prickle. In the marketplaces, her likeness began to appear. Craftsmen carved her face into small amulets, the serpents curling outward in a protective halo. These were not made to frighten, but to guard. For the image of a Gorgon, it was believed, could ward off evil. Merchants hung them above their stalls, sailors tied them to the masts of their ships, and mothers placed them above the cradles of their children. The same face that haunted tales of doom also became a shield against harm. So Medusa lived two lives in the minds of the people, one as the fearsome guardian whose gaze could stop the heart, and another as the silent protector whose image turned away misfortune. She was both curse and blessing, danger and defense. On Sarpedon, she knew nothing of the carvings or the amulets. She knew only that, from time to time, ships would pass closer than they should. She would watch them from the shadow of the cliffs, the serpents in her hair shifting in quiet unease. Sometimes she thought she could hear faint voices carried on the wind, the laughter of sailors, the creak of timbers, but she never revealed herself. It was enough to watch, to know that the world beyond still moved, but the stories were restless things. They did not remain still, any more than the sea could. Over the years, Medusa's tale began to take on the shape of a challenge. Among the bravest or the most foolish of men, the thought of facing the Gorgon became a test of courage. To look upon her and live was a feat no one could claim, and so some began to wonder whether it might be possible to do more than survive her gaze. In the courts of kings and the halls of heroes, her name was spoken as a thing to be overcome. She was no longer just the woman on the distant island. She was an obstacle, a prize, a quest. To slay her would be to prove one's worth to the gods themselves. And among those who heard these whispers was a young man named Perseus. Medusa could not have known, as she walked the quiet paths of her island, that her solitude was drawing to an end. She could not have known that far away, the first steps of a journey toward her were already being taken. Steps that would carry her name into the heart of legend. For now, the legends continued to grow, weaving themselves into the tapestry of Greek myth. They were told in the flickering light of hearth fires, in the open air of the agora, in the hushed corridors of palaces. Each telling made her a little more distant, a little more powerful, and a little less like the mortal woman she had once been. The truth, that she was alone, that she lived quietly among the cliffs and springs of Sarpedon, no longer mattered. The Medusa of the world's imagination had taken her place, and somewhere in that vast world beyond her island, the one who would seek her out had begun his preparations. Far from the cliffs of Sarpedon, on an island where the shoreline curled softly around quiet coves, a young man lived a life that seemed, at first glance, ordinary. His name was Perseus. He rose with the dawn, as fishermen did, and learned the slow patience of nets and tides. He walked the packed earth paths above the harbor, greeting neighbors by name. He helped mend roofs after winter storms and carried jars of water for elderly hands. He was not yet a figure out of legend. He was simply a son, a neighbor, and a youth whose strength was steady rather than showy, whose courage felt like a calm place rather than a fire. Perseus had been raised by his mother, Dano, and by the kindly fisherman who had taken them in, a man named Dictys, whose home smelled of salt and cedar, and whose speech was unhurried. The sea, in all seasons, pressed itself into the rhythm of their days. The gulls calling at first light, the creak of moored boats, the gentle settle of waves against pebbled shore. Perseus listened well and worked hard. The island taught him simple lessons, how to keep balance on a wet deck, how to read cloud and current, how to move carefully, as though the world was something to be treated with respect. But the island also held a small court, and with it, a man whose wishes reached further than his kindness. Polydex, the ruler, had a way of speaking that asked for agreement before the request had even been made. He was not cruel in any single moment, but his wanting was constant, like a tide that pulled and pulled. He admired Dano. He admired her calm, her stillness, her beauty that had nothing to do with ornament. And he wished, in the private rooms of his house, to make that calm and stillness his own. Perseus understood little of politics, but he understood his mother's quiet. He saw how her shoulders drew slightly in when Polydex approached, how her voice softened further, as though to step away without moving. And so Perseus did what sons do. He placed himself, as gently as he could, between what he loved and what he feared might come. He attended feasts when invited. He spoke to the ruler with measured words that neither flattered nor challenged. He made himself useful, present, and watchful, like a young oak in a small courtyard, nothing more. There came a night when Polydex arranged a gathering in the great room of his home. Lamps burned in shallow bowls of oil, their flames steady and low. Musicians sat along the wall and coaxed soft melodies from lyre and pipe. Platters of figs and olives moved from hand to hand. The talk, at first, was simple. Stories of weather, of catches, of births and betrayals. Then, as often happens when night grows deeper and the lamps grow warm, the stories turned to the old great deeds of heroes and their trials, of journeys taken into the wide and dangerous world. Someone spoke the names that sit icily in a Greek mouth: Heracles with his labors, Theseus and the long dark corridors of a maze, Jason and the long oars of the Argo. Polydex listened, his expression thoughtful and bright, and then he asked, almost idly, whether any among them would one day add a new tale to the old ones. It was a question tossed lightly into the air, and yet it settled everywhere at once. Perseus answered without boasting. He did not promise glory. He only said that when the time came, he would not turn from what needed doing. His words were plain, and perhaps that is why they carried weight. A path sometimes begins with a sentence that feels like a small stone placed carefully on the ground. Polydex smiled. He spoke of gifts for a marriage he claimed he meant to make. He said, with a laugh that was mostly air, that horses would please him, fine ones, quick-footed and strong. The room murmured. Horses were no small offering for island folk who counted wealth in boats and nets. Polydex looked to Perseus, and there was a softness to the look, the kind a man uses when guiding a young branch to grow the way he wishes. Perseus, perhaps not seeing the shape of the net, said simply that if horses were wanted, he would bring one. If a gift finer still were wished for, he would bring that instead. He said it calmly, as though offering to mend a sail. He did not know yet that words, once spoken in a hall of listening ears, become a kind of path underfoot. The ruler's smile changed very slightly, like a wave turning at the shore. Finer than a horse, he echoed, and he let the room fill the space after the question. The names of wonders moved around them. Golden apples, a boar fierce enough to scatter armies, a girdle worn by an Amazon queen. Then, as though it were an afterthought, Polydex said the words he had already chosen, the head of the Gorgon. Silence can be a soft cloth. It can also be a stone. The room held its breath, and then, as people often do when faced with something they both fear and wish to see faced by another, they began to murmur again. The name travelled quickly to every ear. Medusa, the woman whose gaze stilled the living, the figure set like an emblem at the edge of maps. Perseus did not leap up. He did not make a show. He set his cup down so gently that the oil in the lamp beside him did not tremble. He asked, in a voice like the calm side of the sea, whether that, then, was the gift the ruler desired above all. Polydex nodded, and the nod was both invitation and snare. A youth might answer pride with pride. Perseus answered with steadiness. "Then I will go," he said, and the room moved. Chairs scraped softly. Someone exhaled. A lyre string hummed from an accidental touch. The decision, once placed in the world, was simple in its shape. It would take longer and more gentleness to understand its cost. Perseus walked home through streets that remembered heat even in the night. The stars felt close enough to lower the head. He moved slowly, as though to set his feet carefully within the world he might be leaving for a time. At the threshold, Dano waited, having heard from a neighbor, from a servant, from the air that carries news faster than feet. She did not question his bravery. She did not tell him to refuse. She placed her hand on his cheek, and in that touch was a map of everything she wished she could make safe. They spoke quietly. He told her the shape of the request, not the weight of it. She told him the names of winds, the way to see a storm before it arrives, the way to pause at a shore and listen before stepping into a boat. He promised to keep his eyes lowered when lowering was wise, and lifted when lifting was needed. She wove a small strip of cloth, soft as sleep, and tied it around his wrist, a token with no magic but the kind that memory makes. Dictys came in the morning with a fisherman's knowledge. Where to find fresh water on bare islands. How to dry a small catch without smoke. How to sleep near a shore without waking to a tide at your ankles. He offered a knife shaped for practical work, its edge honest rather than hungry, and a coil of line that lay in the hand like a well-trained thought. Perseus packed lightly. A cloak for weather, sandals suited to earth and deck, a skin for water that would never feel quite full enough once the sea's thirst was known. He stepped to the door and paused, not to look back with drama, but to listen the way one does before a long walk, to gather the house's quiet inside the ribs, to store it there for later. He took the path to the harbor in the early light, when the water is the color of first tea, and the gulls speak only in soft syllables. Fishermen were already bent to their work. Nets, like large and patient ideas, waited to be set. An old man nodded and placed a hand to where the heart sits, a blessing without words. A child waved, not understanding quests, only departures. Perseus did not yet know the roads he would travel. He did not know the names of the strangers who would one day speak gently to him, nor the names of the gifts he would be granted, nor the careful ways he would learn to move as if the world were a mirror, and he must keep from breaking it. He knew only this, that he had spoken, and that speech had drawn a line forward, and that he would follow it step by step, like a path along a headland where the grass bows to the sea. He left without a boast and without a song. The boat's bow slipped into the morning like a thought that has finally decided to be said. Oars dipped and lifted. The island thinned behind him, softer with each stroke, until it became only a shape the mind could hold. Ahead, the sea opened broad, indifferent and full of quiet teachings. Somewhere beyond that brightness, on a different island where the cliffs hold wind like a secret, a woman lived in measured solitude, her days moving by the sound of water and birds. Their lives, still separate, were already leaning toward one another. The way to slow currents find, at last, a shared channel. Perseus rested the oars and let the boat drift for a moment. He breathed in, deeply, the way a person does when setting something carefully within themselves. Then he set the blades to water again, and the small craft moved on, unhurried, toward a story that had been waiting a very long time to be told. The sea had its own way of marking time. To Perseus, the days slipped by not as dates or numbers, but as the changing color of the water, the shifting weight of the wind, the way the horizon leaned differently under morning light than it did at dusk. He rode when the air was calm and let the current carry him when the breeze turned stubborn. He slept on small, quiet beaches, listening to the tide draw close and then retreat, as though it were breathing beside him. It was during these quiet stretches that help began to arrive, not from chance meetings with mortal hands, but from the will of the gods themselves. Athena was the first to come. She appeared not in a blaze of light or the beating of great wings, but in the calm between waves, her figure outlined against the pale gold of dawn. She stood upon the shore as though she had been there all along, her armor cool and gleaming, her spear planted lightly in the sand. Perseus, rising from sleep, felt no fear. There was only the quiet certainty that the moment was meant to be. She spoke plainly, her voice like water over polished stone. She told him that to face Medusa was not a matter of strength alone, but of care, of precision, of knowing how to move without looking where danger lay. She handed him a shield, its surface polished to a mirror's brightness. "Do not meet her eyes," she said, "but see her as the shield sees her, as reflection, not as truth." Perseus took the shield and turned it in his hands. The light played on its surface, bending the sky and sea into gentle curves. It was heavy enough to guard, yet balanced so that he could carry it far. He thanked her, but Athena did not linger. She nodded once, and then she was gone, her place on the shore taken again by the slow reach of the tide. The next to aid him was Hermes, the messenger. Where Athena was calm and measured, Hermes came with the easy stride of someone who had crossed half the world before breakfast. He carried the scent of fresh air over distant hills, and his smile held a glint of mischief, as though he knew how this story would end. and was content to keep the ending to himself for now. From him, Perseus received winged sandals, light as the breath before speech, yet strong enough to lift him from the earth. Hermes knelt and fastened them to his feet, the leather straps cool against his skin. "They will carry you where the wind would go," Hermes said, "and faster than any oar or hoof. But remember, speed is no use if you do not know where to land." He also gave Perseus a curved sword, its blade shining with a sharpness that seemed almost to hum. It was small enough to wield with one hand, yet it carried the promise of cutting cleanly through whatever was set before it. Hermes did not tell him what the sword had been made to strike, only that it would serve when the moment came. There was one more gift to be given, and it came not from the Olympians, but from those who lived outside their courts. Guided by Hermes, Perseus sought out the Graeae, 3 sisters who shared a single eye between them. They were older than the oldest tree, their hair silver and thin, their voices a soft weaving of breath and whisper. The world knew them as keepers of secrets, and it was to them that Perseus would turn for the path to Medusa's lair. At first, they would not speak. They passed their shared eye from hand to hand, peering at him only long enough to know who stood before them. But Perseus, remembering Athena's counsel and Hermes' grin, did not demand or threaten. Instead, he waited. He listened to the rhythm of their words, the way they leaned toward each other when they spoke, the way their hands rested on one another's arms. When the moment came, quick as a seabird's dive, he took the eye from their passing hand. He did not run or gloat. He simply held it cupped gently in his palm and told them he would return it once. They had told him the way to the nymphs who guarded the last of the tools he would need. They agreed. Their voices, though rasping, held no anger. They spoke of a place hidden from mortal sight, where the nymphs kept treasures not meant for common use. With their directions given, Perseus placed the eye back into the waiting hand, and the sisters, now looking at him with something like respect, let him go. The nymphs welcomed him not as an intruder, but as one who had been expected. From them he received a dark pouch, the Cabeses, woven from threads that felt cool and strong. It was meant to hold what could not be carried openly, what must be kept safe from touch and from sight. And finally, they gave him the helmet of Hades, its surface dull and plain, as though it did not wish to be noticed. When Perseus placed it on his head, the world did not vanish. He did. His hands, his arms, his very form dissolved into the air, leaving only the faint shift of wind to mark his place. "Wear it when you wish to be unseen," the nymph said, "and it will hide you from eyes both mortal and divine." When Perseus left them, his pack was light, yet it held everything he would need. The mirrored shield of Athena, the winged sandals of Hermes, the curved sword, the helmet of invisibility, and the pouch to bear the head of the Gorgon, more than the tools themselves. He carried the knowledge that he did not walk alone, that the gods and their allies had placed these things in his hands because they believed he might succeed. That night he camped on a quiet shore. He laid the gifts beside him and studied each one in turn, not as a warrior might, weighing their use in battle, but as a craftsman might, learning their balance, their feel, their place in his keeping. The stars above seemed brighter than before, as though they had drawn nearer to watch. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Medusa slept, her island wrapped in wind and wave. Perseus knew the journey to her would not be long now. The tools were ready, and so was he. The days that followed were marked not by urgency, but by the measured calm of someone who understood that each step toward his destination was as important as the arrival itself. Perseus did not rush. He moved with the patience of the sea. Guided by the gifts he carried, and by the quiet instructions that still echoed in his mind from those who had placed them in his hands. The first part of his journey was over open water. With the winged sandals strapped to his feet, he skimmed above the waves, each step light as a gull's shadow on the surface. The sea beneath him stretched out in endless patterns, ripples that glimmered like hammered bronze in the morning deep green troughs where the wind ran low, and wide glassy stretches that reflected the clouds so perfectly it felt as though he were moving through the sky itself. He followed the coastline where he could, for the land was a map of its own. Cliffs that rose like ancient walls, beaches where the sand shone white in the sun, headlands crowned with pine and cypress. He passed fishing villages where the smoke of small fires drifted lazily upward, and rocky inlets where seals basked on warm stone, lifting their heads briefly as he went by. At night, he found quiet places to rest. A sheltered cove, the lee side of a dune, the smooth hollow beneath an overhanging rock. He built small fires when needed, the flames hidden from the open sea, and slept with the helmet of Hades within arm's reach. Even in sleep, he was aware of its weight, its strange, invisible presence, ready to wrap him in secrecy at a moment's notice. As he travelled, the air began to change. The wind carried a saltier tang, sharper and more constant. The seabirds grew larger and their cries harsher, and the currents below seemed stronger, tugging toward places unseen. He knew then that he was moving into the waters that edged the unknown, the part of the world where maps ended and the old stories began to press in. It was there, over a stretch of restless, steel-grey sea, that he first saw the coast where the Gorgons were said to live. It was not a single island, but a cluster of jagged outcrops and larger landmasses, their shapes rising from the water like the backs of sleeping giants. The cliffs here were darker than the ones he had passed before, streaked with veins of deep red and black. The air above them was alive with the movement of seabirds, wheeling and calling in great unsettled flocks. Perseus slowed his pace. He had no wish to arrive at Medusa's lair unprepared, nor to stumble upon her in a way that would force haste. Instead, he landed on a small, empty isle at the edge of the cluster, a place where the grass grew in low, wind-bent clumps, and the rocks were worn smooth by centuries of waves. From here, he could see the greater island where the Gorgons dwelled, its cliffs rising steeply, the top shrouded in mist. He waited there for a full day, watching. The sun traced its path across the sky, the light changing from the pale gold of morning to the deep amber of late afternoon. The sea moved ceaselessly, throwing white foam against the rocks. Once, in the far distance, he thought he saw movement along the cliff. A figure, perhaps, though it was too far to be sure. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, Perseus readied himself. He strapped the winged sandals more tightly, feeling their sure grip against his feet. He fastened the mirrored shield to his left arm, adjusting the strap until it sat exactly where he could turn it without effort. He placed the curved sword at his side and set the helmet of Hades upon his head. In an instant, the world changed, his form vanishing into the air, leaving only the faintest shift in the grass where he stood. Moving silently, he lifted from the ground and began the final approach. The sandals carried him over the dark water with barely a sound, the waves below stretching endlessly in all directions. The mist around the main island thickened as he drew closer, swirling in slow currents as though moved by something more than wind. The cliffs loomed ahead, vast and shadowed, their faces cut with ledges and narrow paths worn by no human foot. He landed near the mouth of a small ravine, where the rock opened into a sheltered hollow. Here, the air was cooler, tinged with the faint scent of damp stone and salt. The cries of the seabirds faded, replaced by a quieter sound, a rhythmic hiss, almost too soft to notice at first, like the shifting of dry grass in the wind. He knew then that he was close. Beyond the hollow lay the inner part of the island, a place untouched by the sea's roar. The ground was strewn with shapes, some jagged and broken, others eerily smooth. In the moonlight, they took on the look of weathered stones, until the eye caught their outlines. The curve of a shoulder, the sweep of a hand, the line of a face frozen mid-breath. These were the ones who had come before him, who had looked upon the Gorgon and felt her gaze turn them to unyielding stone. Perseus kept his eyes low, letting the shield guide his view. In its mirrored surface, the shapes appeared dim and warped, their details softened, but they were enough to mark his path. He stepped carefully between them, the sandals making no sound against the earth. The ravine opened into a wide, shadowed space. Here, the air was utterly still, as though the island itself were holding its breath. The hissing sound was clearer now, a slow, constant murmur that rose and fell in uneven rhythm. Somewhere ahead, beyond the dark shapes of stone, Medusa waited. Perseus drew in a slow breath. The journey was nearly at its end. The air within the heart of the island felt unlike any he had breathed before, still, heavy, and faintly warm, as though it had been held in place for centuries. The earth beneath Perseus's feet was smooth in some places, sharp and broken in others, as if it had once been struck by great force. Around him, the statues of those who had come before stood like silent witnesses, their expressions locked in the final moment before the stone had claimed them. He moved quietly, the helmet of Hades masking him from sight, the mirrored shield guiding his steps. The reflection showed only fragments of what lay ahead. The pale curve of a stone arm, the shadowed edge of a rock, the faint shimmer of something that might have been movement. He kept his gaze fixed on this warped image, never lifting his eyes to meet the air directly. The sound came again, that soft, dry hiss, rising and falling as though in time with breath. It was not constant. It pulsed, slow and alive. The serpents in Medusa's hair, he thought, must sleep as she did, their movements bound to her stillness. The space widened into a cavern that opened to the sky, its walls formed from ancient stone. Here, moonlight poured in from above, spilling in long beams that fell upon the center of the hollow. In that pool of pale light lay three figures. The first two, Steno and Euryale, were larger than he had expected, their forms both human and more than human. Their hair shimmered with the faint suggestion of serpents, though they were still now, resting upon the smooth rock. Their chests rose and fell in deep, slow rhythm, the breath of immortals, who would never wake to mortal death. Between them lay the third, smaller, her frame more delicate, and yet no less dangerous for it. Medusa, her hair, even in rest, was alive. The serpents coiled loosely around her head and shoulders, some draped along her arm, others resting against the stone beneath her. They shifted occasionally, tongues flicking in dreams only they knew. Her face was turned slightly away from him, her features softened by sleep. Yet the sight, even caught only in the shield's reflection, held something beyond beauty, something beyond fear. She slept as one who had grown used to the absence of interruption. The lines of her body were relaxed, her hands open and uncurled. There was no tension in her brow, no hint of the monstrous rage the stories had painted her with. In this moment, she looked less like the terror of sailors, and more like the quiet figure she might once have been, walking the marble halls of a temple at dawn. Perseus's steps were measured, his breathing slow. He moved toward her, not as a hunter toward prey, but as a man carrying the weight of what must be done. The gifts he bore had brought him here: the shield, the sword, the sandals, the helmet. Yet they could not remove the truth that the act ahead was his alone. Around the three sisters, the ground was strewn with more statues, their poses twisted by the moment of transformation. Some stood as though shielding themselves, others reached forward as if in warning. Moss had begun to grow on a few, softening the hard lines, and the moonlight washed them all in pale silver, making them seem less like victims and more like guardians of the place. The cavern's walls carried faint carvings, worn by time, patterns of serpents, of waves, of eyes framed in spirals. Whether they had been made by the sisters themselves or by others long gone, he could not tell. The images seemed to watch as he passed, their gaze indirect yet constant. Stino stirred slightly, her head turning in her sleep, the faint scrape of her arm against the rock echoing softly in the stillness. Perseus froze, his muscles tightening, every sound in the world seeming to draw back and wait. After a long moment, her breathing settled again, and he moved forward. The mirrored surface of the shield caught Medusa's form more clearly now. He saw the slow rise and fall of her chest, the gentle shifting of her serpents. He felt, strangely, a reluctance, not from fear, but from the knowledge that this moment would end her long solitude. Her watch over this island, the strange balance she had kept here between life and stone. In another life, in another telling, perhaps they might have spoken, but in this one, the gods had set their will, and he was the hand that would carry it out. He adjusted his grip on the sword, feeling the curve of the hilt settle into his palm. The blade was steady in his hand, the metal catching the faint light without glare. He took one final breath, letting the air fill him, holding it for a heartbeat before releasing it slowly. The hiss of the serpents rose again, faint but distinct, as though they sensed something moving toward them. The moment had come. The cavern seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind above the opening had stilled, and the moonlight that poured down felt almost solid, as though it had weight and presence. Perseus stood within that quiet, invisible to all eyes but his own, watching the slow rhythm of Medusa's breathing in the mirrored curve of his shield. She lay as she had for years, surrounded by the still guardians of her making, her sisters close beside her, the serpents in her hair shifting only in the restless language of dreams. The shield gave him only fragments, the soft curve of her cheek where the moonlight touched it, the gentle sway of a serpent curling and uncurling itself along her arm. In that reflection she seemed less like the shadowed figure from Sailor's Tales, and more like a being carved from the same ancient stillness that shaped the island itself. Perseus did not rush. He took one step forward, then another, each movement deliberate and noiseless. The sandals made him light upon the ground, but it was his own care that kept the air around him undisturbed. In his right hand, the sword felt steady, balanced, neither pulling him forward nor holding him back. His left arm, bent to keep the shield before him, ached slightly from the long journey, but he welcomed the ache. It was a reminder of the path that had led him here. Closer now, he could hear the serpents more clearly. It was not a constant hiss, but a shifting sound, like dry reeds stirred by the gentlest wind. They moved against each other softly, their scales whispering. A few lifted their heads, tasting the air, but without sight of him, they seemed uncertain. Stino murmured in her sleep, the sound deep and almost human, before settling again into silence. Euryale turned her head slightly, but her breathing did not change. The two immortals remained bound to their dreams, untroubled by the presence that moved between them and their mortal sister. Perseus paused one final time, letting his breath deepen, letting his heart beat slow. He thought of the gifts he had been given, the shield that kept his gaze safe, the sandals that had carried him over sea and land, the sword that would serve for this one precise strike. He thought of Athena's measured words, of Hermes' knowing smile, of the nymphs who had placed the helmet in his hands. All of them had brought him to this place, and then he thought of Medusa herself, the woman who had once walked marble halls at dawn, who had tended a sacred flame, who had stood in the quiet dignity of her vow, before the gods turned their faces from her. He wondered, briefly, if she dreamed now of that life, if her mind, in sleep, wandered back to the temple's cool shadows and the sound of sandals on stone. The moment could not be held forever. With a final, steadying breath, Perseus lowered the shield just enough to see her full reflection, his eyes never leaving the softened image on the bronze. His arm drew back, the sword's curve catching a faint thread of moonlight. The air between them seemed to tighten, every particle poised in anticipation. The strike, when it came, was not violent in sound. There was no cry, no thunderous crash. It was a movement as swift and certain as a wave's break, a single, fluid arc of the blade through the space between them. The serpents hissed sharply, a chorus of sudden awareness, then stilled. In the shield's mirrored surface, Perseus saw the moment her form went utterly still. The lines of her face remained soft, unmarked by pain, as though she had only shifted into a deeper sleep. Then the image in the shield changed, not from life to death, but to something beyond either. Her head, now severed, lay upon the stone, the serpents still alive, curling protectively around her as if unwilling to release her to the world beyond. He did not lift his gaze to her directly. Instead, he moved carefully, placing the sword aside and drawing forth the dark pouch, the cabeces, given to him by the nymphs. The fabric was cool and strong beneath his fingers, woven tightly enough to hold what should never be seen. With slow, deliberate movements, he slid the pouch beneath the head, letting it fall into the shadowed interior. The serpents hissed once more, but softer now, as if their defiance had faded into the folds of the cloth. When the pouch was closed and tied, the air in the cavern seemed to shift. It was as though a long-held breath had been released, the weight of countless years lifting slightly from the stones. The statues around him stood as they always had, but their presence felt different now. No longer guardians bound to a living gaze, but memorials to a story that had reached its turning point. Perseus straightened, the pouch secure at his side. He retrieved his sword and lifted the shield once more, though now its reflection showed only the cavern, the moonlight, and the still forms of Steno and Euryale. The immortals slept on, their dreams unbroken, unaware that their mortal sister's watch had ended. Without a sound, Perseus turned toward the path that would lead him back to the ravine, back to the outer cliffs, and to the sea that waited beyond. His steps were as quiet as they had been upon entering, the helmet of Hades shrouding him from the eyes of gods and mortals alike. The moonlight followed him until the last bend in the rock, and then he was gone, leaving the hollow as it had been, silent, still marked by the presence of beings who would remain long after his own footsteps had faded. Above, the wind began to move again, carrying with it the faint salt of the sea. The cavern was already behind him when the first change began. Perseus had not looked back, his eyes fixed on the path through the ravine, the pouch heavy and silent at his side. The helmet of Hades still cloaked him from sight, and the shield rested against his arm, catching only slivers of moonlight between the rocks. But within the hollow, where Medusa's body lay still in the silver light, the air began to stir. It was not the kind of movement caused by wind, but something deeper, as though the stone itself were exhaling after holding its breath for many years. From the place where her blood touched the rock, color bloomed, red, rich, and bright, spreading like ink in water. From that living red, a shape began to rise. At first, it was no more than the shadow of something forming, a shimmer against the still air. Then, piece by piece, it took shape. A creature unlike any that had walked the earth before. Its body was that of a horse, strong and graceful, its muscles sculpted as if by the hand of a god. But from its back rose wings, broad and powerful, each feather catching the moonlight like silver fire. Pegasus. The newborn stood for a moment beside the still form of Medusa, its great eyes wide and clear, reflecting both the moon above and the stone guardians all around. The serpents that had been her crown lay quiet now, their hissing silenced. Pegasus lowered its head, touching the stone floor lightly with its muzzle, a gesture that was almost like farewell. Then, with a single movement, it spread its wings. The sound was like a sail catching the wind, soft, steady, and full of promise. The cavern filled with the scent of air from beyond the island, fresh and cool as the wings beat once, twice, lifting the creature from the earth. It rose into the open sky above the hollow, its white coat shining so brightly that for a moment it seemed a second moon had joined the first. The feathers of its wings flashed silver as they caught the light, and the rhythm of their movement carried it higher, past the cliffs and into the realm of the stars. From far below, Perseus did not see its first flight. He moved along the edge of the cliffs, intent on the path ahead, unaware that above him a new story was beginning, one that would travel far beyond the shores of this island. But others would see, sailors passing in the night, their ships rocked gently by the tide, would later swear that they had glimpsed a winged horse rising from the sea's edge, its flight so silent it might have been a dream. The birth of Pegasus was not just the birth of a creature, but of a symbol. In the years to come, poets would speak of it as a sign that even in endings there could be beginnings, that even in the shadow of death something pure could take shape and rise. Some would say that Pegasus was a gift to Medusa from the gods, an unlooked-for grace that came not in her life, but in the echo she left behind. The winged horse did not linger. It flew eastward, its path tracing the bright edge of the horizon. With each beat of its wings, the air seemed lighter, as though it carried away some of the heaviness that had long rested on this place. The island, with its statues and silent sisters, remained, but the sky now held a trace of movement that would not soon be forgotten. Back in the hollow, the moonlight still fell upon the stone floor. The red bloom had faded to a darker hue, already seeping into the rock. The air settled again, the walls and carvings returning to their long watch. Yet the memory of that moment, the sudden, quiet lift into the sky, would stay, as if the stone itself had kept it. Perseus reached the outer cliffs as the night deepened. The sea lay before him, dark and calm, the stars mirrored in its surface. He paused for a moment, breathing in the salt air, letting the sound of the waves fill him. The pouch at his side was secure, the helmet still cloaking him from all sight, but there was a faint sense, something he could not name, that the island had changed in his passing. Far above, unseen, Pegasus continued its flight, each beat of its wings carrying it farther from the place of its birth and closer to the many stories it would one day join. But in that moment, its journey was simply its own, unhurried, unburdened, and new beneath the endless sky. The night still lay heavy over the sea when Perseus stepped to the very edge of the cliff. Below, the tide pressed gently against the rocks, its voice a low, endless murmur. The pouch at his side felt heavier than its size could explain, not only for what it carried, but for what it meant. Within it lay the end of Medusa's long exile, the end of the watch she had kept over her island, the end of a chapter in a story that had begun long before he had been born. He stood for a moment longer, letting the salt wind wrap around him. The helmet of Hades still hid him from sight, yet the sea seemed to sense his presence, tossing spray upward in greeting or in farewell. Somewhere far above, a faint silver shape cut across the night. Pegasus, already a whisper in the darkness, its wings carrying it toward places unknown. Perseus tightened the pouch's strap across his chest, adjusted the mirrored shield on his arm, and stepped into the air. The winged sandals caught him at once, their light, sure grip carrying him above the cliff's edge and out over the open water. Beneath him, the waves stretched into darkness, their surfaces touched by starlight, each crest a small, moving spark. He did not hurry. The journey home was not a race, but a return, and each beat of the sandals against the air was a quiet rhythm, matching the slow rise and fall of the sea. He followed no set line. The stars above and the faint glimmer of the coast in the distance were his only guides. As the night gave way to the first pale line of dawn, the water changed color. The dark blues deepened into green, then softened to gold where the sun's first touch brushed its surface. Gulls began to cry, their wings catching the morning light as they wheeled above distant shoals. The world was waking, and Perseus moved within its waking, silent and unseen. He landed briefly on a small island to rest. It was little more than a stretch of sand and rock, with a handful of low shrubs bent by the wind. He drank from his water skin, ate a few figs from the pouch at his belt, and sat with his back against a sun-warmed stone. The pouch holding Medusa's head lay beside him, still and quiet, yet it seemed to hold its own presence, as if the weight of the gaze within could be felt even without being seen. From this small place, he could see the faint shape of larger lands to the east. He knew that when he stepped onto those shores, the story would no longer be only his. Others would see the proof he carried. Others would speak his name alongside hers, weaving the two together in ways neither of them had chosen. As the day warmed, Perseus rose and set off again. The sandals carried him smoothly over the sea, the air rushing past in soft currents. Hours passed in the easy, steady rhythm of flight. Below him, the coastline unfolded. Coves where the water lay still as glass, headlands where the waves broke in white spray, villages where thin trails of smoke rose from morning fires. From time to time, he caught sight of fishermen in their boats, their heads bent over nets, unaware that a figure passed far above them. The helmet of Hades kept him unseen, but even without it, the soundless path he traced in the air would have been little more than a shadow in their peripheral vision, something they might think was a bird or a trick of the light on the water. By the second night, the air had grown warmer, carrying the scents of pine and dry earth. He was nearing the lands he had known, the harbors where he had walked as a boy, the winding streets where he had heard stories of other heroes and their far-off trials. Soon he would walk those streets again, but as someone changed, still, his mind returned often to the island behind him. He thought of the statues in the moonlit cavern, of the two sisters who had slept on, untouched by his passage, of the way Medusa's face had looked in the shield. Peaceful, almost human, even in the final moment, he thought, too, of Pegasus, its wings cutting into the night, with no sound but the air parting around them, These were things the world beyond would never know in their true form, and he felt a quiet responsibility to carry them within him. At last, the familiar line of his home island came into view. The hills rose gently from the shore, dotted with olive groves, and low houses clustered together for shelter against the wind. The harbour curved inward like an open hand, its waters calm and speckled with the lights of anchored boats. Perseus descended toward the edge of the shore, landing in a quiet stretch where the sand was marked only by the tracks of seabirds. He removed the helmet and the sandals, placing them carefully beside the shield and the pouch. The sun was just beginning to lift above the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. For a moment, he simply stood there, breathing in the scent of land after so many days over the sea. The sound of the waves was softer here, the air warmer, the world more still, but even in that stillness, the weight of his journey lingered. Not heavy in the way of regret, but in the way of something that had been done and could not be undone. He gathered the gifts again, securing them for the short walk ahead. Soon, the streets would open before him, and the faces of those he knew would turn to see what he carried. Soon, the story of his return would begin to weave itself into the larger tapestry of myth. But, for this last stretch of the journey, he walked alone, the sea at his back, the day before him, and the quiet knowledge that some stories do not end. They simply find new shores. Long after Perseus had walked the quiet streets of his home and set the pouch before those who had sent him, the story of Medusa began to move outward, carried on the breath of sailors, the ink of poets, and the whispers of storytellers at evening fires. It was no longer confined to the rocky island where she had lived in exile, nor to the moonlit cavern where her gaze had once held its power. In the ports of the Aegean, her name was spoken in low tones by men who had never seen her but claimed to know a man who had. They told of her hair of living serpents, their eyes glinting in the dark, and of the statues, hundreds, perhaps thousands, that stood around her in eternal stillness. Some said she had been a monster from the first, born with fangs and scales, her heart as cold as stone. Others swore she had once been beautiful, a maiden of the temple, whose only fault was to draw the gaze of a god. In the marble halls of distant cities, sculptors began to carve her likeness, sometimes as a fierce and grim creature, with sharp teeth and a snarling mouth, sometimes as a sorrowful woman, her eyes cast down as though under the weight of her fate. On painted vases, her form could be found between swirls of ocean waves, or in the center of spirals meant to ward off evil. In these images, she was both feared and revered, a figure who belonged to the threshold between danger and protection. As the years turned to centuries, her image shifted again. In some lands, she became a guardian, her head carved above doorways and on shields to keep away harm. Children would walk beneath her gaze without fear, told that she watched over them from the world beyond. In other places, her name was still used to warn, a reminder of the consequences that might follow those who angered the gods or stepped beyond the boundaries set for them. The poets, too, found her. In their verses, they told of the stillness of her island, the silver gleam of her gaze, the sound of the sea that never ceased its watch around her home. Some imagined her thoughts in the long years before Perseus came, moments of longing for the life she had lost, or quiet acceptance of the one she had been given. Others painted her as unyielding, her heart like the stone she created, her will as enduring as the cliffs that faced the sea. In distant marketplaces, merchants would sell small charms shaped like her head, the serpents coiled in miniature around her face. Travelers would carry them on long journeys, believing they could keep misfortune at bay. These charms were touched before setting out to sea, before crossing a mountain pass, before stepping into a place where danger might be waiting unseen. And yet, for all the fear and reverence she inspired, there remained in her story a thread of something quieter, a sense that she was more than the simple label of monster. Some storytellers, speaking to children under the stars, would change the ending just slightly. In their telling, Perseus did not come to kill her, but to free her from a curse. The head he carried away was not a trophy, but a key, a way to give her rest after years of solitude. In these softer tellings, Pegasus was not merely a marvel born from her death, but a piece of her spirit set free, given wings to wander the skies. The children who heard these stories would look up at the night and imagine the white-winged horse passing over, and in its shadow they would picture a woman with hair like living ribbons, her eyes no longer dangerous but filled with quiet peace. Through the centuries, Medusa's image found its way into places she could never have imagined. She was carved into coins, her gaze fixed in profile beside kings and queens. She appeared in the mosaics of bathhouses, where warm water lapped at stone floors. Her likeness was painted on the walls of villas, sometimes hidden in corners, sometimes placed boldly in the open. Each new hand that shaped her, each voice that told her story, added something of its own. Some made her more terrible, her mouth open in a silent cry. Others softened her features until she seemed almost like a goddess of the harvest, her serpents no more threatening than coiled vines. And still, she endured. Her name never faded, her story never vanished, because she belonged not only to the age in which she lived, but to all the ages that followed. She became a mirror in which each generation saw something of itself, its fears, its hopes, its warnings, and its dreams. Even now, when the wind moves across certain cliffs and the sea churns below, some say they can hear the faintest sound of serpents shifting, the soft movement of scales against one another. It is not a sound of menace, but of presence, a reminder that some stories never truly leave the world. They remain in the stones, in the water, in the breath of the wind that carries them forward. Medusa's tale is not only of her end, but of the many ways she was remembered. She was a warning, a guardian, a curse, a symbol, and in some hearts, a figure of quiet endurance. And so she walks still, not in flesh, but in the endless retellings that carry her through time, from one voice to another, under the stars, by the fire, in the hush before sleep. And so, the tale of Medusa drifts to its close, not with the clash of steel or the cry of battle, but with the soft turning of the tide. The island where she once walked lies quiet now, its stones warmed by the sun in the day and silvered by the moon at night. The sea moves endlessly against its shores, carrying with it the salt of 1,000 journeys and the murmurs of stories too old to name. In your mind's eye, you can picture it still, the winding path that leads to the heart of the island, the ancient rocks shaped by time, the hollow where the statues stand in their eternal watch. You can imagine the way the air feels there, heavy with the scent of the sea and the faint coolness of shaded stone. It is not a place of fear now, but of stillness, a place where the world seems to slow, and each breath feels as though it has always been part of the wind. The waves, tireless and constant, carry the memory of her name far beyond the island's edge. They pass it to the shores of distant lands, where it is spoken in the glow of firelight. Under the hum of the night's first stars, it becomes part of the fabric of countless nights, each retelling adding a new thread, each listener weaving their own quiet vision of the woman with the serpent hair. You can let the story rest there, in that timeless space where past and present meet, Imagine the sun lowering into the horizon, the sky deepening to gold, then amber, then the soft, endless blue of night. Stars begin to appear one by one, scattered like the dust of dreams across the sky. Somewhere above, Pegasus may still pass, its wings gliding soundlessly through the dark, carrying with it the last free breath of Medusa's spirit. There is no need to chase it. Like all things in the night, it moves at its own pace, and it will always return, circling back in the quiet of thought and memory. The sea will keep its rhythm, the stones will keep their watch, and the story will keep its place in the hearts of those who let it in. As you listen, you can feel your own breath begin to match the slow turning of the waves. Inhale like the tide drawing in toward the shore. Exhale like the water slipping back into the depths. In this rhythm, there is nothing to hold on to and nothing to push away. Only the steady ebb and flow that has always been and will always be. Let your mind rest on the details, soft as they are now. The curve of a marble cheek beneath moonlight, the delicate coil of a serpent. Asleep, the glint of water on the edge of a shield, the brush of wind across the wings of a horse born from a drop of blood. These images do not need to be held tightly. They can pass through you like clouds across the face of the moon, slow, silent, and certain in their return. If you listen closely, you might hear it. Not the hiss of serpents or the clash of heroes, but the gentle whisper of the sea against the island rocks. It is the same sound that filled Medusa's days, the same sound that will fill countless nights long after her story is forgotten by the world. It is the voice of something older than her, older than Perseus, older even than the gods. This is where the story settles, not in triumph or in tragedy, but in the simple truth that all things return to stillness. The waves find their shore, the wind finds its quiet, and the listener finds their rest. So let the island fade now, slowly, until it is only a shape in the distance. Let the sea widen between you, its surface calm and unbroken. Let the stars above grow brighter, each one a soft lantern in the deep blue. Your eyes grow heavier, your breath slower. The warmth of the night wraps round you like a cloak, and the sound of the sea, that endless, ancient sound, carries you deeper into rest. And if in dreams you find yourself walking a quiet shore with the moon high above and the air rich with salt, perhaps you will see a white-winged figure far away, rising into the stars, and perhaps you will feel, just for a moment, the presence of a gaze, not to harm, but to watch over you, as countless nights watch over countless sleepers. The sea moves on, the stars remain, and you are at rest.